5 small towns where people keep disappearing. We all know someone can get lost in a big city. They're anonymous, sprawling, and it's easy to just fade into the crowd. But what happens when people start vanishing from a small town? A place where everyone knows your name, your family, your business. A place where a single person going missing is a town-wide crisis. Now, imagine that happening over and over and over again. We're not talking about one-off tragedies. We're talking about unsettling patterns, clusters of disappearances that defy easy answers. These are the stories that curdle into local legends, spark massive investigations, and leave a permanent stain of fear on a community. Today, we're exploring 5 of these towns, places where the mystery of the missing is a part of their identity. We'll go from a town being swallowed by a fire that will outlive us all, to a remote village that became a modern-day Bermuda Triangle, and finally, to a ghost story so powerful it's become a legend about an entire village that vanished into thin air. These are the places that blur the line between documented history and our deepest fears. Centralia, Pennsylvania. Our first stop takes us to the coal country of Pennsylvania, to a town that was erased not by a single, terrifying event, but by a slow, relentless enemy that attacked from below. This is Centralia, a town whose population vanished because of a fire that started over 60 years ago and is expected to burn for another 250 more. Back in the 1960s, Centralia was a small but lively town of about 1,500 people. It was a classic mining community built on a rich network of anthracite coal seams that had been its lifeblood for a century. But that very foundation would seal its fate. And it all started with a town cleanup. In May of 1962, wanting to tidy up the local landfill for Memorial Day, the town council hired some volunteer firefighters to set the dump ablaze. This was a common, if illegal, practice. The landfill was located in an old, abandoned strip mine pit. On May 27th, they lit the fire. When they were done, they put out the flames and went home, thinking the job was finished. It wasn't. Deep in the pit, the fire wasn't fully out. It smoldered its way through an unsealed opening and found its way into the massive, interconnected labyrinth of abandoned coal mines that snaked beneath the entire town. The fire had just found an almost endless supply of fuel. The very coal that built Centralia was now going to burn it to the ground. For years, most residents had no idea an inferno was raging just a few hundred feet beneath their homes. Early attempts to stop it failed, thanks to a lack of money and a total underestimation of the fire's scale. But by the late 1970s, the consequences started literally bubbling to the surface. Toxic gases, like carbon monoxide, began venting out of cracks in the ground. The earth itself became warm to the touch. People's gardens withered and died as the roots were cooked from below. The true horror of the situation crashed into view in 1981. A 12-year-old boy named Todd Domboski was playing in his backyard when the ground just gave way. A sinkhole, 150 feet deep and belching hot steam, opened up and swallowed him. He barely managed to grab onto a tree root before his cousin could pull him out, saving him from a horrific death. That incident made national news. It was now terrifyingly clear that the ground Centralia stood on was poisonous and unstable. This wasn't a town where people vanished because of a monster or a mystery. People left Centralia because their entire world was becoming unlivable. The federal government finally stepped in, allocating over $40 million for a voluntary relocation program in 1984. One by one, families were bought out, their houses demolished, leaving behind empty lots and driveways that led to nowhere. The population collapsed. From over 1,000 people in 1980, it dropped to just a handful. By 2017, only 5 residents were left, refusing to abandon their homes. Today, Centralia is a ghost town. The streets are an eerie, crumbling grid laid over a subterranean furnace. Route 61, the main road through town, became so cracked and warped it was nicknamed the Graffiti Highway, before it was finally buried in dirt in 2020. Smoke and steam still snake from the scarred earth, a constant reminder of the fire that burns on. The people of Centralia didn't vanish into thin air. Their entire community was forced to, erased by a slow-motion disaster that has no end in sight. Portlock, Alaska. From a town consumed by fire, we head way north to the foggy, rugged coast of Alaska's Kenai Peninsula. Here, tucked into a bay called Port Chatham, are the rotting remains of Portlock. But unlike Centralia, the story of Portlock's end is a messy tangle of official records and terrifying local folklore. The government files tell one story. The whispers of those who fled tell another. Portlock got its start in the early 20th century as a salmon cannery. It was a remote but working village, big enough to get its own post office in 1921, mostly home to fishermen and cannery workers, many of Russian Aleut descent. For a few decades, life went on as usual. And then, people started leaving. The official reason Portlock was abandoned around 1950 is purely practical. A new highway on the other side of the peninsula made other towns easier to get to, drawing people away from remote, boat access-only villages like Portlock. The cannery closed, the jobs dried up, and people moved to nearby communities. The post office shut down in 1951, marking the town's formal death. It's a simple, logical explanation, but it's not the story you'll hear from the families who lived there. According to the lore that grew in the decades after its abandonment, the people of Portlock didn't just leave, they fled. They were supposedly driven out by a monster from the forest, a creature the Sugpiaq people call the Nananak. Described as a large, hairy, Bigfoot-like creature, the Nananak is blamed for a string of disappearances and bizarre deaths that terrorized the community. The stories claim that hunters would go into the woods and never come back. Loggers would find giant, human-like tracks in the mud. The most famous tale is about a logger named Andrew Camlock, who was found dead in 1931, his skull crushed by a heavy piece of logging equipment that locals claimed was too heavy for any man to wield as a weapon. These tales, which mostly surfaced years after the town was empty, painted a picture of a community living in fear, stalked by something in the woods. This constant terror, the legend says, is what really emptied the town, until no one was left. Skeptics are quick to point out that these stories only really took hold long after Portlock was a ghost town, and that the harsh Alaskan wilderness, with its bears and treacherous landscape, is more than capable of explaining accidents and disappearances that were later blamed on a monster. And yet, the legend is so powerful it's been the subject of TV shows, with investigators and descendants returning to the ruins, looking for answers. So what really happened? Was it a simple case of economics? Or did the people of this isolated village encounter something so frightening they abandoned their entire lives to escape it? The official records are clean, but the folklore tells a much darker story, one that still haunts the skeletal remains of Portlock today. The Bennington Triangle, Vermont. Our next story takes us to the deep woods of southwestern Vermont, to a place that doesn't even have a formal name, just a terrifying nickname, the Bennington Triangle. This isn't one event, but a string of them. Between 1945 and 1950, 5 people walked into this patch of wilderness and seemingly vanished off the face of the earth, creating a modern American mystery that defies all easy explanation. The disappearances started in November 1945. 74-year-old Mid-Eye Rivers, an experienced hunter and woodsman who knew the area intimately, was guiding a group. He walked ahead of his party and was never seen again. The only trace found was a single rifle cartridge in a stream. An expert doesn't just get lost in his own backyard. A year later came the most famous case. On December 1st, 1946, 18-year-old college sophomore Paula Jean Weldon went for a hike on the popular Long Trail. She was seen by several people, including an elderly couple walking about 100 yards behind her. They saw her round a bend in the path, but when they reached the same spot, she was gone. An enormous search involving the FBI found nothing. Her case caused such an outcry over the poor investigation that it led to the creation of the Vermont State Police. The pattern grew stranger. On December 1st, 1949, exactly 3 years after Paula Weldon vanished, A 68-year-old veteran named James Tedford got on a bus to return to the soldiers' home in Bennington. He was seen on the bus by other passengers, apparently napping in his seat. But when the bus arrived at its destination, Tedford was gone. His luggage was still in the overhead rack, a bus schedule open on his empty seat. He had vanished from a moving vehicle. The next year, 2 more people disappeared in the span of 16 days. First, 8-year-old Paul Jepson vanished from a truck while his mother was distracted. Then, 53-year-old Frida Langer disappeared after falling in a stream and heading back to her campsite to change clothes. Langer is the only victim whose body was ever found, discovered months later in an area that had already been extensively searched. Due to the state of her remains, no cause of death could be determined. The wilderness is vast, and the weather is treacherous. Logical explanations exist, but they don't account for the sheer strangeness of the cases. A man vanishing from a moving bus? An experienced hiker found months later in a heavily searched area? The Bennington Triangle is a place where, for 5 terrifying years, the line between a simple missing persons case and impossible mystery seemed to dissolve into the trees. Nome, Alaska. We return now to the harsh landscape of Alaska, but this story isn't ancient history. It's a modern and deeply unsettling mystery, centered on the remote town of Nome. For decades, a shocking number of people have disappeared in and around this small community, making it the poster child for a phenomenon people call the Alaska Triangle. Nome sits on the edge of the Bering Sea. It's an isolated town of just a few thousand people, and the wilderness around it is vast, beautiful, and incredibly dangerous. It's also a place where a frighteningly high number of people have gone missing, many of them native Alaskans visiting from smaller villages. The pattern was often the same. Someone would be seen in town, maybe at a bar, and then they would just vanish. The disappearances sparked terrifying theories, the worst being that a serial killer was stalking the residents. These fears were famously sensationalized by the 2009 movie The Fourth Kind, which claimed the disappearances were actually alien abductions. The movie was a work of fiction that used fake, archival footage, and it was heavily criticized by Nome's residents for exploiting their real-life tragedies for entertainment. The real situation was so bad that in 2005, the FBI launched a full investigation into 24 cases of missing people and unexplained deaths. Their conclusion wasn't aliens or a serial killer. They determined the disappearances were likely a tragic combination of 2 things: excessive alcohol and the lethal environment. They concluded that many of the missing, while intoxicated, probably wandered into the brutal winter landscape and died of exposure, or fell into the freezing river or sea. For many locals and the families of the missing, that explanation felt too simple. It didn't sit right. They argued that even someone who was drunk wouldn't just wander out onto the sea ice in the middle of a winter storm. Their distrust fueled the belief that something else was going on. The disappearances in Nome are part of a much wider, more baffling pattern. The Alaska Triangle is a colloquial term for a huge stretch of wilderness in Alaska with a missing persons rate more than double the national average. Since the 1970s, an estimated 20,000 people have vanished there. The most famous case was in 1972, when a plane carrying House Majority Leader Hale Boggs vanished without a trace. Despite a massive search, nothing was ever found. Pragmatic explanations point to Alaska's untamed wildness, treacherous mountains, hidden crevasses, and sudden, violent weather. It's a land where it is terrifyingly easy to disappear. But even so, the sheer number of cases in and around Nome leaves a deep sense of unease. It's a town that serves as a stark reminder that you can still walk out of the light and never be seen again. Lake Anjikuni, Canada. We've seen towns erased by fire and fear, but for our final story, we head into the frozen north of Canada for a tale that has become one of the greatest ghost stories of the 20th century. This isn't about a few people disappearing. This is the legend of an entire village that supposedly vanished from the face of the earth. This is the story of Lake Anjikuni. The story goes like this. In November of 1930, a fur trapper named Joe LaBelle was making his way through the snows of what is now Nunavut. He knew the area well and was heading toward a small Inuit village on the shore of Lake Anjikuni, a community of about 30 people he'd traded with before. But as he got closer, he was struck by the silence. A deep, unnatural quiet. When he walked into the village, he found it completely empty. It was as if everyone had vanished mid-action. He found a pot of frozen stew still hanging over a fire pit. He saw an unfinished child's parka with the bone needles still resting in it. Most unnervingly, the villagers' rifles were left leaning against their tents, something no Inuit would ever leave behind. The horror wasn't over. He found the village's 7 sled dogs tied to their posts, all having starved to death, even though there was plenty of food in the nearby storage huts. And then, LaBelle made the most chilling discovery of all. He checked the village's burial ground. The graves had been opened. The bodies of the dead were gone. It's an absolutely terrifying story. The only problem? There's no credible evidence it ever actually happened. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police have stated for decades that they have no record of any such event. The entire story is widely considered an urban legend, likely originating from a sensationalized 1930 newspaper article by a journalist known for embellishment. If it's a hoax, it's a masterful one that has taken on a life of its own, with the number of villagers growing from 30 to over 1,000 in some retellings. So why does it persist? Because it's a perfect ghost story. It taps into our deepest fears, that without a sound, without a reason, and without a trace, our entire world could just disappear. The theories born from the legend range from alien abduction, bolstered by some versions of the tale that mention strange lights in the sky, to ancient folklore about malevolent spirits. Was the story of Lake Anjikuni a journalistic tall tale that snowballed into a world-famous legend? Almost certainly. But the lack of a real crime scene or a real investigation is exactly what makes it the ultimate vanishing. It's a story that has become a modern myth, representing the chilling possibility of being completely and totally erased. So, what do we make of these stories? They range from a documented, real-world disaster in Centralia to a historical mystery in the Bennington Triangle, to the powerful folklore of Portlock, and the legendary ghost story of Lake Anjikuni. They show us that a community can be erased by fire, by fear, or by forces we might never understand. The logical explanations are there, but they don't always quiet the chilling questions that are left behind. What's your theory, especially on the Bennington Triangle? Do you think it was a string of tragic accidents? Or did something else happen? Let me know what you think in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this journey into the unknown, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one.